Thank you, Authors Guild, for having me. A little more background on myself. I am a CPA. I have about 20 years experience practicing. I am the unique CPA that never really did audit and never really did tax because it didn't sound interesting to me as much as I liked accounting. And I started my career in a financial advisory services practice, which was really helping clients and attorneys figure out numbers. About 11 years ago, I had an opportunity to testify as an expert witness in a case against, it was actually on behalf of a small publisher against one of their authors who had a royalty auditor that came in and made these wild accusations about underpayments that really didn't bear out to be true. And in that final decision by the judge, he wrote in his opinion that if you had wanted to get the numbers right in the first place, you should have just hired Miss Sates. So I got interested in the field and then really started doing most of my work on behalf of authors. I also work doing royalty audits on patent holders, trademark owners, really anybody that has a right to receive royalties. But I really like my work on behalf of authors because I feel like I'm making a big difference in an individual's life as opposed to working on a big dispute for a multinational corporation. And while I like to serve those clients just as well as I serve my author clients, I just find this work very rewarding. So I'm going to get into some royalty statement basics depending on where you are in your writing career. You may have a really good understanding of your royalty statements, or you might be brand new to getting statements and have no idea what they say, or again, you could be an established author and your statements have either gotten so complex that you can't understand them, or so summarized you don't know what's going on. But they do seem to be a source of frustration for a lot of authors. So we'll get into some of the basics. We just rebranded our whole company, so I'm very excited about the art, but that's an aside. So what is typically contained on royalty statements? I use this chart for a lot of presentations. So you'll see in the green, this is almost what's always on there. I've yet to see a statement that doesn't have this kind of information, which is kind of the most basic stuff you need to know to see how you're being paid for the sales of your book. There's additional information that may or may not be on statements, and that would be your life-to-date sales in units, gross units returned, dollars. Package versus standalone probably doesn't play as much to this group, but if you're in the higher education space, that's a big deal because a lot of products are packaged with other educational platforms. Rentals are becoming more common, especially in higher education. So some publishers will tell you if your book was sold as a rental, some won't. Electronic versions and access, that's more and more showing up on a royalty statement. And then if there's sales of other stuff, that other stuff is generally going to be on your royalty statement somewhere, but it might not be described there. Now, the information that's rarely on a statement is over here, which is more of the details. And these are really details that you would need to have, and information you would want to have to understand if your royalties are correct. So you'd want to know what your publisher is giving away for free. You may want to know where the sales are going, what countries, if you have specific royalty rates for specific countries. If your book is packaged with other things, so a DVD companion or a children's book with a toy, or your book is packaged with another book, you'd want to know what's going on there. And then this information at the bottom is really inventory records, which I'll get into in a little bit. But looking at what was printed and what was shipped out and what was destroyed will be a test to help you understand if the sales that are reported to you are right. And then what I call subrights details, that could also be known as foreign rights, but subsidiary rights are really any other rights that your publisher is allowed to grant to others to make some version of your book. And oftentimes it will just show up as a number on your statement. So there might be a version of your book printed in France, and you'll just see subrights France, but you really won't know what's behind that number. Now, this is a really simple example of a statement, and I'm sure we all wish ours could look this straightforward. This is a little bit different than some might be used to. It's going to depend if you're paid on net revenue for your sales, which you may be for some of your books and not others. But typically in trade, you'll be paid a percentage of the list price of the book. So this statement is meant to represent just one particular ISBN. If you were an author, you may have 5 ISBNs. Let's say you have one book out there. You might have 5, a special ISBN for hardcover, paperback. You might have an audio version. You might have an ebook. So typically your royalties are reported at the ISBN level. So you can imagine this is one statement. Depending on, you might have multiple books with the same publisher, or how many versions or iterations of that book there are out there, that royalty statements can become very large. One of the things I'd also point out here is that you may have deductions, and a lot of times publishers will deduct things that are perfectly legitimate but not give you an explanation. So if you have a statement and you have a deduction on that statement and you don't know what it's for, that's something you would want to ask your publisher. A balance forward, that's typically something that's coming from the previous royalty statement. So for example, if you hadn't earned your advance, and you might have a little bit of advance left to work off, that would be shown on this statement, potentially as a balance forward. The other thing you should pay close attention to is life-to-date units. Now, life-to-date units are important for a couple of reasons. One, if you have a tiering clause in your contract, which changes the royalty rate based on how many copies are sold, you want to make sure that this is being properly calculated. Also, here we have 4,868 units sold, life to date 64, 62. I can't do the math in my head that quickly, but presumably the life to date units on the previous statement should be around 1,500 or so. So it's a really simple check to see if the units are rolling forward properly. The other thing to keep in mind is to always go back to your contract. Now, if you have tiering that's going to happen at certain sales levels, does that tiering apply to just print books, or is it print and ebooks, or are there separate tiers for each of those? So that's something you want to be cognizant of, and just understanding your statements and knowing what questions you might want to ask your publisher. I don't have anything published, but if I did, I would probably have a little notebook saying what are my total units for my first statement, add the next units for my second statement, and see if that matches the life to date, and keep that running. So here's some of the red flags that we see in royalty statements. Again, calculations that are not supported. So you might just have a number on there. You might see something that just says adjustment, and that really goes also into insufficient detail. If your publisher can't answer questions you may have about your royalty statements, obviously that's a late flag. If your publisher is sending payments late, that's a red flag. Now again, a lot of this is not going to apply to some of the bigger publishing houses, but if you're with a smaller publisher, it may. So I recently had a client who always got her statements 6 months late with no explanation, and we went in and did some work with her and found out there were much bigger problems there. Escalation payments not in accordance with the contract clauses. So that's your tiering. That's something that should be fairly easy for you as an author to spot. And if you find a mistake, I would go to the publisher immediately and ask for that. Your payments are not as high as you expected based on discussions with individuals within your publisher. I'll get into other sources of information that might make you think your payment should be higher, and we can talk about the pros and cons of those. But if there is a marketing person saying your book is doing great and we had X number of sales and you don't see it hitting your royalty statement, I would inquire with that individual. to see where the sales are. Now, they may have been speaking to you at the end of a reporting period and the sales haven't hit your statement. There's a perfectly legitimate reason for that. But if you're hearing that your book is, you know, the best thing since sliced bread and you're getting paltry royalties and low sales, again, that's something you would want to dig into. Repeated incorrect calculations. I have seen great royalty statements that come out of an automated system at the publisher. I've also seen statements that are on an Excel spreadsheet that were manually done, and there's incorrect calculations. If you deal with spreadsheets a lot, you should be, or are, you know, a little like to dig into that stuff, you'll be able to spot an Excel statement. Just an Excel statement on its own would be a red flag to me, because that means you're dealing with a publisher that doesn't have systems in place to generate a royalty statement. Poor internal controls. I don't want to get too much into the CPA accounting world, but if you are with a major publisher or any kind of publicly traded company, it's not a bad idea to read the annual reports and see what's going on with the company as a whole. So I had an issue where there were problems with an author's statements. I went and read the annual reports of the publisher, and they had disclosed that they had problems with internal control and royalty reporting in a different division. So it wasn't our division, but again, it gave me pause to say, are there problems throughout the company? So that's something, that's public information you can find if there's any kind of accounting problems, restatements, internal controls is a red flag, that kind of thing. If there's a change in your publisher's accounting software, obviously they're not going to tell you, hey, we changed accounting software. But if you see a different kind of statement start to come in, that's probably an indication. If your statement looks different, it's an indication they've changed something. And whenever there's a change, there's potential for mistakes to be made, because all of the old information in the system needs to be ported into a new accounting package and new software. And whenever that happens, things can just not translate properly. So if you start getting a new form of royalty statement, pay close attention to what's on there. Also, if there's a change in royalty accountants or the contact that you normally speak to in royalties, that individual might have had a lot of history with your contract and your royalties, and a new person comes in. You might have special clauses in your contract that say your royalties should be calculated differently for a certain bucket of sales, and a new individual might come in and not actually read that contract and not make that special calculation. So again, if a new individual comes in, it's a good idea to pay close attention to your statements. And finally, business mergers and acquisitions, or some kind of change in ownership. This is key because as we've all seen over the past 20 years, this major consolidation in the publishing industry, there are a lot of legacy systems that need to be merged, and there's a lot of contracts, particularly if you have a book that's been in print for a while. There's legacy contracts out there, and when a merger happens, there's thousands of contracts and authors to deal with and get them all into one system. And again, getting that, it's not an automated process. An individual needs to go through, read your contract, make sure your rates are set up properly, make sure everything's flowing the same way. And a lot of times mistakes happen in that process. And this slide I put in here just to show you how complicated a publisher's systems may be. By all means, nobody needs to absorb this, but this is actually based off something I received from a publisher when I said, hey, can you tell me how your systems work and how you generate royalty payments? And this is what I got. And actually, the audit went back to 2011, and there was a whole other chart of how things worked. So my point with this is that not that publishers are deliberately making mistakes in your system or trying to underpay their authors. My point being is this is really complicated stuff, and it goes through a lot of different places to ultimately generate a royalty payment to an author. So now I'm going to talk about how you can try to analyze your statements and really where to start. So here's what I would gather. Like I said, a pad of paper, or even better, if you are If you are proficient in Excel, that's a great place to start doing some of your work. You're going to want all of your historical royalty statements. You're going to want all of your contracts, amendments, addendums, anything you have related to your books. Any relevant correspondence with your publisher, and also just a list in your head of any issues you've had. So maybe in the past, your publisher sent you a check that was outside of the royalty cycle and said, well, this is because we found an ISBN that was missing. Well, that would be great to get an extra check, but it also might be an indication that everything you are due to be paid is not actually getting paid. So anything that's come up in the past, I always would put in the back of your mind. If you're working with an outside expert, I caution on sharing correspondence with your publisher, because you need to make sure that you are not covered by any confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements to share that. Typically, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not giving legal advice, but typically you can share all of your stuff with your attorney. And also you can share your royalty statements and your contracts with your attorneys and advisors. But I would be careful if you've signed any kind of blanket information that says you cannot share this information with somebody else. But assuming you're looking at information on your own, this is the kind of things you'd like to gather. So being the accounting and Excel nerd that I am, this is what I would do if I had all of my statements in one place. I would try and analyze them in one place. So this is a fancy version of something we did in Excel based on an author's statements. And there could be a lot more buckets than are on here, but right now I just have print units and electronic units. This particular slide was developed for higher education, so the electronic rate is much lower than you would typically see in trade, which would be 25% or more. So I like to just put that out there, but without recreating the slide, it's good to see what your units are, what the sales of those units are, your royalties, and then you can calculate what is the effective price per unit, what's the effective royalty rate, and what's the royalty rate per unit. Now, again, you might have a lot of audiobooks, so you would put audiobooks in this kind of summary. You might have a lot of export sales, and you would want to group export sales. Really, anything you'd want to look at and try and understand the trends is something that you would try and analyze in one place. So this is based on the data that I just showed in that detailed chart, and this shows that that while units of books are going up, the effective royalty is going down. Now, there could be a very legitimate reason for this. It might have been that in the beginning you had a hardcover come out, and then as you move to paperback, you receive a lower royalty on those paperback books. But if that's not the case, you might want to dig a little further and try and figure out why your effective royalty rate is going down. Are your books being sold at high discount? Are there special sales going on and you're not receiving the full royalty rate? Is there something else in the contract that calls for a lower rate? And so while your sales units are going up, your royalties are declining. If you can't figure that out, that's a really good question to ask your publisher. I like this slide because you might look at your dollars and see a dip in 2011 here. Most common reason you would see this dip is some kind of user error. We do this all the time, and all of the work that we do is trend things out. And if I have somebody bring this to me, I'll say, go back and check your data. So there could be a problem with what you've put in there. If not, and you've checked it, your publisher might have missed something in this time period and not calculated and paid all of the royalties that were due. So I'm really a big fan of trends because I think you can see things going on that you wouldn't see flipping through a multi-page statement. And also back to creating all of this data, most of your statements should have summary level information in the first few pages. And so instead of going through the hundreds of pages, if you have hundreds of pages, you can pull it off those summary pages, put them in a very simple table, and really hit Chart Wizard in Excel and get a chart that will give you a bigger picture. Bookwire. This is something I want to mention. Bookwire is a site used by publishers to purchase ISBNs for books that they're going to release. They have a great interface that anyone can go on, type in an author's name, and it will return all of the registered ISBNs for that author. So this is something you can use to go type your name in and then see what ISBNs are out there. You can then take that list of ISBNs that I'll call out there to what appears on your royalty statements. And sometimes you might find, hey, there's something here that's not on my royalty statements. What is that? If you find that, I would search that ISBN out on out on the web. Sometimes you'll find that it is a legitimate ISBN that is for a foreign edition, and that may not show up on your statements. It may show up somewhere else. It might show up in subrights, which we can talk about more. But I really like Bookwire for a quick check, especially if you are a new author and you see 4 ISBNs show up on your royalty statement. Again, CD, hardcover, softcover, ebook, and then you find a couple more. You might find some versions of your book out there that aren't on your royalty statement. And that is something I would go directly to my publisher and say, hey, what is this? Why isn't it on my statement? Now, it can be a little bit finicky. So if your name is Jane Smith, you're going to get a lot of hits for Jane Smith, but it has some decent filters in there where you can, I think, sort by author and find that you are Jane E. Smith, and it will return your books. But we do this whenever we're analyzing statements for an author, just to get a list of the universe out there and then compare it to royalty statements. Nielsen Bookscan, many of you have heard of it. This is, well, even before I started doing this, I know some folks that publish books and authors out there. Ingram used to actually have a number that you could dial in, and it would tell you the sales of a book for the last week and month based on what they were distributing. So that was a really long time ago. Now you can't get that information for free, but if you are working with an agent, your agent generally has an account with Nielsen Bookscan. And what Nielsen Bookscan does is collects point of sales information from the book trade and will report back how many sales there are. And publishers use this obviously for competitive reasons to see what's going on with a book. So if the data should be directionally correct. It's not going to match your royalty statements, and it's not going to match your royalty statements because of timing and also because certain books are not going to be captured by Nielsen Bookscan. So if you have a coffee table book that's typically sold through, let's say, Anthropology or Urban Outfitters or something like that, that's not going to be picked up by Nielsen Bookscan, so it might not work for your book. But if your book goes through Barnes & Noble and Target and those types of retailers, it should be picked up. And I also understand, although I've never seen it, is that if you have the Amazon author platform, I don't have the access because I'm not an author, you can get access to some of the Nielsen Bookscan information. So it's a really great check if you think your royalties are too low, and you can get this, either you sign up on your own or you can get this through an agent, and you see that your Nielsen Bookscan numbers are actually a little bit lower than when you're seeing on your statements, you're probably okay. Conversely, if you see that your Nielsen Bookscan numbers are far in excess of what you've ever seen on a royalty statement, then you probably do have a problem and should go to your publisher immediately and just ask them to help you reconcile that difference. Amazon author rank. This is what I want to caution against, and this is what this was kind of at the heart of the case I testified on about 11 years ago. There's a lot of blogs out there that will tell you about the Amazon author rank and its algorithms, which I don't fully understand. But essentially, if you have a big spike in one day, that can influence your rank, and then it goes down from there. But if you have let's say your book was written up in a magazine and a lot of people went and looked up the book and bought your book for one day, that's going to have a large spike, and then it's going to trail off. Whereas if an author had consistent sales of a book, they're never going to have a large spike, but they're going to consistently move up a little bit. What can happen with the author rank is that books that have lower sales at a certain point in time will have a higher author rank than an author with more total sales. So I've had authors come to me and say, but my Amazon author rank is great, like my royalty statements must be wrong. That's not really the case. So I would caution against going with Amazon author rank as it being any kind of indication of what your actual sales are. Nielsen Bookscan is a much better indicator of that, although I would understand that Amazon author rank would be exciting to see what your book is doing day to day. But again, it can be easily manipulated by a lot of different factors. So this is close to some of the red flags, but common errors you might find. So incorrect royalty base. Is the publisher making a mistake in applying your paperback rate to your hardcover rate? Are they applying an ebook rate to a paper book rate or vice versa? So that's something you would want to look for. So again, you have to go back to your contract, look at the type of sales that you have, and are the rates being applied properly? Underreported sales, this gets back to something like a Bookwire check. Are there ISBNs out there that for whatever reason are not making it onto your royalty statements? I had a client who sold or wrote math textbooks, and there was a whole bunch of math textbooks and they were for the higher education market. They also did versions that went to the high school market. For whatever reason, the publisher never coded the high school textbooks into their system. And we found these ISBNs and found he had been paid, I think he had been underpaid about $300,000 just for the sales into the high school market. So that ISBN check through Bookwire is really helpful. Inappropriate deductions. So your contract might have a definition of what a publisher can deduct from sales, or what the definition of net sales is if your royalties are based on a net sales calculation. I had a client that was with a print-on-demand publisher, and it said that this print-on-demand publisher could deduct certain things like freight and some other minor reasonable things. But what this publisher was actually deducting from the sales was also the cost to print the books, which was not allowed. So that's something you want to look for. You might not have this unless you go to the next step and ask for additional documentation. But again, inappropriate deductions could play into your statements. Misapplied conversion rates, if there are subsidiary rights agreements out there, and say the publisher is being paid in euros and then translating it into dollars, that's something that could be an error in royalty reporting. Misunderstanding of the license agreement. Again, these are individuals that put information from your agreement into their systems. If you have a complex calculation in there, that could be misunderstood, or it could just not be translated from the text into the publisher's system, or there could be some disagreement over the terms, what you believe the terms mean versus what the publisher believes the terms mean. And the last one we got into a little bit before, but it's something that you can spot pretty easily, which is this non-escalation of royalty rates. So after 5,000 copies are sold, your rate jumps 2%. You can look at your statements and see that didn't happen. That could be a simple mistake by the publisher to not put that trigger within the royalty reporting system to increase the rate. And again, you want to go back to your contract and look very carefully what counts to that pool to get you to the units. Is it all print? Is it just soft cover? Is it just hardcover? Is it everything combined? You want to be careful about what that means. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the specific records you can ask your publisher for, so you can kind of go through and do a deeper dive into your royalty statements and understand the royalty payments you're making. Something I'll start with is how long can you go back? How much information can you look at? Now, if you've had a book that's just been published in the last year, this is probably not an important question. if you've had a book that's been in continuous print for a number of years, it is an important question. So first off, you may have a clause in your contract that allows you to request certain information or allows one of your advisors to request information. I call them audit clauses, but often they don't have the word audit. They'll say examination of records, retention of records, those types of terms. So you want to look at that and see what it says. So it may say something like the author and or his or her representative has a right to request certain records for 2 years after a statement is rendered. This is important because if you don't have a time limitation, typically you can look at records going as far back as the breach of contract statute of limitations in the state in which the contract is governed. I'm not going to give you all of those statutes, but a lot of contracts are governed by New York law. New York gives you 6 years. Some contracts are governed by California. California is 4 years. So that's important to know, because you might have become disillusioned with your publisher, let's say, and you think something's going on and it's been going on for 10 years. Well, that may be the case or it may not, but you can't go back and get 10 years worth of records in most jurisdictions. So if you don't have a limitation, you don't have something that says you can look back and the time is limited, I would try and do a little digging and see how far back you can go and ask for all of the information going back for that time period, because it's always better to get it in one ask rather than saying, let me look at the last 2 years and then go back to the publisher and ask them for more information. Generally speaking, this is what you want, and this is the stuff you would need to create a royalty statement and create a payment to an author. So really, instead of trying to back into what you should be paid, this is almost like taking the information that's out there and then using what you know from your contract and try to recreate what royalties should have been paid to you. So the things you're going to ask for is detailed sales records. What's in detailed sales records are usually the customer, the date of the sale, were there any returns, what was the price, and what type of product was sold. The detailed sales records should be by ISBN. You'd also want an an invoice number on there. Inventory records. Inventory is something that a lot of publishers will just hand over to you, which is basically what they'll call a reconciliation to print. So inventory records are going to contain what was printed, what was shipped out, and then the stuff that was shipped out has either been sold, given away as free, or destroyed, what came back, so returns, and then what's left. Now, there's typically going to be some amount of inventory that is unaccounted for, and some amount of inventory that's unaccounted for is reasonable, but it's got to be a reasonable percentage. I would say that is about up to 3% of total books printed that's unaccounted for. That wouldn't really be a red flag. Now, if there is 15% of inventory unaccounted for, there's a big problem. You'd also want to ask for your foreign rights contracts. Some publishing agreements give you the ability to approve any foreign versions, adaptations, translations of your book. Some contracts do not. They just give the publisher the right to enter into these agreements. But you would want to ask for those agreements so you can see what's going on with your book. This is important because a lot of authors will say, my friend just went to Germany and found a copy of my book, and I didn't know that my book was being sold in Germany, and how much is out there? Well, either the publisher entered into a legitimate sub-license with a German publisher, or they didn't. So you want to see what rights they have granted to others. Other grants of rights, again, this could be a grant to adapt your book. It could be an audio version. It could be anything else in the contract that the publisher is allowed to do. So you'd want to see any contracts for those. And then also, to the extent deductions are allowed from your royalties, you're going to want specific information related to the deductions that are made from your royalty statements. So how are you going to analyze your information? Some of this is a little bit of a repeat, but looking at your royalty statements, what types of sales have you had over time, and do they make sense? what's your average price per unit? What's the overall revenue trend? What's the overall unit trends? Now, if you have a trade book and it was really popular 3 years ago and it's in the decline, that might make sense. If you have a really popular evergreen book that's been in continuous print for 20 years and the sales are pretty steady, and then you see a sudden decrease, you might want to understand that. It's so important to go back to your audit clause, because there's, as much as there's boilerplate, not your audit clause, your agreement, as much as there's boilerplate contracts out there, there's still a lot of variation that we see. So you might see that the publisher has a right to give away as many free goods as they want. You really want to pay attention to those escalation clauses. What if your book is packaged with other things? Now, you don't see this as much in pure trade, but if you have a children's book that's packaged with a CD or a toy or another author, how are you going to be paid on that? The detailed sales records should have details about what kind of sale was made. Again, if it's not laid out in the detailed sales records, it should be by ISBN, and you should be able to look at a particular ISBN and figure out, really looking by just Googling your ISBN, figure out, is that a print version? Is it an ebook? Is it an audio book? What is it? So you really want to take a look at the detailed sales records, and then what you would do is take those records and figure out what royalty rate should be applied to them based on your contract, and how does that tie into what's on your royalty statements. One of the other things to look out for is a return for reserves on your royalty statements. Now, your contract probably says that a publisher can keep a reasonable return for reserves. Older contracts would have some percentage listed in there, what that reasonable percentage would be. So say 10% of sales. If you have returns coming in and the publisher is not releasing the return for reserves, I would ask your publisher, why is that? Why won't you release this? Or if your reserve for returns is really high and you're not seeing big returns, again, why does the publisher need to keep that? I wouldn't say that that's a big finding the money, but it's money that the publisher's holding on to that you're losing the benefit of investing. So that's something to keep an eye on. In the bill of materials really gets into if you have packaged goods. So if your book is part of a compilation, if they take parts of your book and combine it with somebody else's book, you're going to want to see how are you being paid royalties on that. It's typically by page count if you're combining a book. If your book is sold with other stuff, the bill of materials should show you everything in that package and how attribution is given to the components within that package, and therefore how much are you being paid in royalties. Again, the subsidiary rights records, what you should get if you ask for it is the contract that your publisher has made with, let's say, again, a French publisher. You should see that contract, and you should see what the terms are. Now, that will specify the royalty rate, the payment schedule, all of the stuff, just like your publishing agreement with your publisher. And then what you'd also want to ask for is what information has your publisher received with respect to the remittance of dollars under that contract. Now, you might see, let's say, an agreement with a French publisher to do a French version of your book, and no royalties come through after that. But you do see books being sold in the French market from a friend or a trip that you went on. Then you would want to go back to your publisher and say, I know this thing's in print. You entered into the agreement 2 years ago. Where are the royalties? And again, the inventory records. How do books move? And essentially, the inventory record should tell you what was sold, and you want to look and see what was sold. Does that match what is sold on the sales detail that's been provided, and also the royalty statements? The other thing I'll mention here is destroyed copies. It's legitimate for copies to be destroyed if a publisher gets returns from a retailer and they cannot be resold. But what you do want to look for is a really high number of destroyed copies. I can't tell you what that number would be. I'd say 3 to 5% is probably reasonable. if you see destroyed copies in excess of what was returned, you're going to want to ask your publisher, why are these being destroyed? They might have just printed too many. They might have missed their forecast and printed too many, but you should ask about that if it looks like an unreasonable amount being destroyed. So what are the results of doing all of this work? You're going to find, well, two types of findings, but I should say three. You can find that everything is fine. There's no issues. I've never personally seen that, but sometimes it's just very small issues. But there's either clear mistakes or miscalculations in the calculation of your royalties, or there are legitimate disagreements over how to interpret the contract. If you get into that, you need to consider if you want to engage an attorney. Typically, underreporting that I've seen, it varies from year to year, but it's 10 to 20% of royalty payments. And why would you want to do this? Does it upset the publisher? Generally not. I think publishers understand that authors want to know what's behind the calculation of their royalties and have a right to know. I put the scale here just to try and show that it helps balance the relationship a little bit. Obviously, publishers are some multi-billion dollar organizations, and you are an individual author. So the leverage going into the negotiation is not in your favor. But an author that is showing that they are willing to proactively go in and check out how their royalties are calculated will probably get a little more attention from the publisher in terms of making sure that the publisher gets the calculation right. And so that's it with what to look for. I'm gonna have Jennifer open it up to questions. I think some have come in, and I will be happy to answer whatever you have.
Okay, so let's see what questions we have here. If you want to submit a question, you can do that using the Q&A button. It should be in the toolbar on your screen, either on the top or the bottom. So let's go ahead and look through these. This question's from Steve. Says, I'm about to retire, so is it okay to destroy really old royalty statements? I represented some of my projects as agent and packager for others. I want to clean out my office completely.
I would say yes, unless you want them for some reason. It sounds like you don't. So I would destroy anything prior to 6 years. Your publisher should have copies of those records if you ever needed to get them. The other thing you might want to do is, if you want an electronic record, ask your publisher if they can send you PDF versions of the statements, and most will.
Okay. The next one's from Tracy. What do you do when you're pretty sure the sales reported are being underestimated and the publisher is a huge one that has rights to your next book?
Well, you can do everything I said. You can try and verify it. If you are convinced for whatever reason, you might want to engage an outside accountant to help you review that. And I can talk more offline about what that involves. And you also, if you're really, really convinced of this, you may want to engage a publishing attorney to help you with the negotiation of your next book if you have that opportunity. Sometimes you can use the threat of an audit as leverage. But if you're really not comfortable, I think I'd have to know more about why you're not comfortable, because obviously you would be leery about going into the next book with them.
Okay. So move along, try to get as many of these done as we can. This one says, hi, Julie, I'm a literary translator and most contracts specify that I earn, oh, sorry, that just jumped away from me, that I earn an advanced against all royalties plus royalties. But one contract with the publisher says they will pay an outright fee of X and a royalty of X%. I understood this to mean I would get royalties as of first copy sold, i.e. the fee was not in advance. However, I have never received a royalty check with my statements. Based on your experience, how do you understand that wording, and what do you think how do you think I should contact the publisher to discuss?
Well, to be fair, I would want to read the wording, but it does sound like there is a flat fee payment for you to do the work, and then royalties should follow after that. So you should be earning royalties. You could also ask the publisher, can you give me a statement of the sales or a royalty statement, and see how they lay it out on there. They might be counting it as an advance. And it may be that all of your other works had an advance system in place and then royalties, and whoever was setting you up just assumed that this new contract was the same as the others. So again, that's what we see happen a lot. There's just assumptions that there's a new contract out there. It's going to follow everything the other contracts did, and therefore nothing different is done. So whoever's calculating royalties isn't expecting you to get royalties from day one. So I think my understanding matches yours. I just want to read the language to be sure.
The next two questions, I'm going to kind of group two together because they're very similar. Can you estimate how often there is a real problem with the calculations? As in, if we aren't checking that closely, how likely is it we're being underpaid? And someone else asked the same question, like, how common do you think these errors are? If you could guess, like, would it be 5%? Would it be more?
I would say probably 75% of the time there is some error. If it's not to say it's a big error, but there's errors all the time. And again, that goes back to the human input. So the error might not be that your royalty rate is 10%, the dollars that needs to be applied to is, let's say, $7,500, so the royalty should be $750. That's a really simple calculation error, which doesn't necessarily happen. But there can be a lot of errors with misapplying the rate to the type of book. A lot of errors you'll find in the tiering clauses, but it's rare to have a very clean review. So I've had one recently where everything tied out within the penny except for, I think, $200. And quite frankly, I was suspicious of the data I got because it was just too perfect. You expect that a publisher is not going to be able to account for certain units, that things are going to get lost in a warehouse, and you would expect to be some variation. That's normal in accounting, and that's normal in reporting. But I do see errors. Probably 75% may be too conservative. It's certainly not 5%.
Let's see. Things are jumping around. My agent does not send me royalty statements if there are no funds due to me. I have to ask for them each time. Is this something, is it worth bugging them?
Yes, they're your statements. So I would ask for them.
Next question, is Nielsen Bookscan the only way to double check approximately how many buy books have been sold? What does typically charge?
So Nielsen Bookscan it's tricky. I had to get an account through a third-party seller, but you can get it by contacting them. But I think it's around $50 to $65 per ISBN. Again, if you have an agent, your agent probably has an account and can get it for you. And the other thing I would look into is if you are on that Amazon author portal. I don't know how they charge or how that works, but they will give you access to Bookscan information through there. But that is the best source because that's collecting point of sale data from retailers. So that's giving you a good idea of how much your book is selling through. So if it's less than what's on your statements, you're in good shape. If it's a lot more than what's on your statements, then there is a problem. But it's a really good quick check, and it's probably worth the investment if you don't have too many ISBNs.
Okay. Do sales of subrights show on a statement only once the subright's advance money has been paid off? For example, if audio rights are bought for $5,000 and that shows up on your statement without sales info, will the sales info show once the $5,000 is earned out?
It should. So assuming that the subright agreement is like a typical publishing agreement where there is an advance and then there are royalties after that advance has been earned out, you would expect to see the advance payment, and then you probably wouldn't see any of the royalties being earned off like you would on your regular publishing statement. You wouldn't see those and while the advance is being earned off. But once money is remitted to the publisher for those subrights, say an ongoing royalty, that should start to show up on your statement. So it's really as the cash comes in, that's what you see on your statement. The reason I say to look at subrights is it's often handled by an entirely different department within the publisher. It's not run through the royalties department. That department will execute the subrights contracts, collect the money, and then as money comes in, send a note to royalties and say, hey, Jane Smith received this much for her subrights agreement. So sometimes it can get lost in the mix, and it's really as the cash comes in. If you were to want to do an audit of your subrights, so to speak, then you would want to ask for the agreement and then all of the statements that your publisher got from this third party licensee.
Okay. Do publishers have to provide inventory statements on request?
It depends. Your contract might, there's a few contracts out there that specify what they need to provide. Most contracts are very broad and will say the books of account or any records used to verify royalties. A lot of the publishers will just give it to you. Maybe not to the author, they'll give it to me, but it depends on the publisher. So some publisher, it's just matter of course, they're going to give over the inventory records. There's some other publishers, I see this more in smaller university presses, that say we don't have to show that. That's not sales records. But if you really are truly doing an audit is meant to verify. So you want to verify the sales records to the royalty statements to something else that shows sales, which is inventory. So it really depends on the publisher. You know, I have these grand plans about what to get in an audit clause for authors that specifically says what a publisher has to provide. I don't know that they would ever agree to that kind of thing. But, you know, if it's really general, a publisher can say, well, that's not covered by this general statement. But if it's really specific, you have to be careful you're not leaving something out, but also you could generally lay out the things that you'd want to see. So unless your contract specifically says they have to give it to you, I don't know that they have to give it to you.
Okay. I think that kind of relates to this next question, which is, have you ever negotiated or helped negotiate a contract? And if so, what terms did you try especially hard to get that are not normally granted to authors?
Sure. So again, I think I don't want to say in the old days, but 15 to 20 years ago, audit clauses were in a lot of contracts and they were very general. Now, either they will be left out. That doesn't mean you can't get the information. That's another presentation almost. But what I would advise authors to get is an audit clause that says they have a right to review the records. I would strongly advise do not get a time limitation in there. So I had an author that didn't have an audit clause. His publisher said you can't do an audit for years, and they gave him an amendment and they gave him an audit clause, and he was thrilled to get it. And the audit clause said you may look back 2 years. He didn't realize that actually where his book was published and where the contract was had an 11-year statute of limitations. So the publisher kind of pulled the wool over his eyes by saying, here, we'll grant you the clause, you can look back 2 years. Well, legally, without that clause, he could have gone to court and gotten 11 years. So I would strongly advise against getting that time limitation in there. Now, you're going to have to give on some things, and what do you want the most? If you have the 2-year limitation, that just means you have to be on top of it and make sure you're questioning your statements every 2 years if you feel that you need to. The other thing you can do if you have that limitation is if you are not sure about something in your royalty statement and maybe you don't want to audit on your own or you don't want to engage someone, put in a very formal letter to your publisher, I received this statement on this date. I do not accept it because of X, Y, and Z. And that will kind of stop the clock for that statement, because a lot of times they'll say, unless you dispute it in writing, you've been deemed to have accepted a statement. So that's what I would have the audit clause in there. Also, you want to have really specific definitions of what rights you're granting. So does a publisher want to make a game with your work or not? Well, you have to think about, do you want to allow them to do that? You want to be, I mean, there's so many, I have a whole other list of things and I'm trying to think of them off the top of my head, but but you really want as clear as you can contract language. So if they talk about deductions, what are those deductions that are allowed specifically? If the publisher says you get a certain rate on special sales, what is a special sale? Every term in your contract should be defined, and there's things that you might not think about but can come back later and be a problem. So I think as much specificity as you can is helpful. The other thing I would kind of preach to all authors, especially with your first book, is consider investing in a good publishing attorney that can help you through the process. I know we hear attorneys and think it's a big expense. It's probably not as expensive as you think and can save you a lot of money in the long run. So I just put that plug out there to the attorneys. I am not an attorney, but I think it really helps in negotiating your contract, and also somebody that's done publishing contracts before.
And also, if you are a member, the Authors Guild does do contract reviews. You know, they're not that we can negotiate, you know, for you, but the Authors Guild does do contract reviews. So if you do have a contract that you have some questions about, you can send it to our staff here and they'll look at it. Only if you're a member though. Let's see here. Can you comment on how helpful the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society is for authors?
No, I don't have a lot of experience with them. I mean, I have some experience with some of the global organizations that are collecting overseas, and they distribute the funds to individual organizations, but I don't think I can comment on how helpful that particular organization is.
How much might it cost to have someone do an audit for us? I have 4 books since 2011 from one publisher, for example.
I don't want to quote fees here. It depends. Some audits, if depending on what the royalties have been and our experience with the publisher, we will do it on a contingency basis, meaning we will not charge the author anything unless we collect something from the publisher. So then our fee will be a percentage of what's collected. For others, if we're a little unsure, we'll charge an hourly rate. And what I always do with authors is first look at their contracts and look at their royalty statements. We don't charge for that, and try and scope it out and then give a better idea. And then figure out what the hourly fee is. Sometimes it's a really low hourly fee plus some kind of higher rate if we recover. The other thing to look for, and this is something you should put in your contract, is if there's an underpayment finding of 5% or greater, the publisher will reimburse the author for the cost of an audit. That still shows up, and if you know to ask for that, you might be able to get it. So then if you want to hire a professional to do an audit and you find something, the publisher is not only going to pay you the underpayment, but also pay for your auditor. I can say audits do not cost, $300,000, but they cost it could be a small review, could be a couple of $1,000s up to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how much work there is. But again, with my clients, we always scope it out and we say, you can spend this much money and then see where we are and see how cooperative the publisher is. Do you want to go further, or do you want to stop here, and have you gotten enough information?
Next one says, hi, Julie. What can an author do if her agent doesn't send royalties in a timely manner? How long does an agent have to pass on the royalty statement? So
that, again, should be driven by the written agreement, hopefully, that you have with your agent. So royalty statements, depending on when you're paid, typically come out 3 months after the close of the statement cycle. So if you're paid, quarterly, it comes out like 3 months later into the next quarter. So if you know when your statements come out and what the period is, and then when they come out, I don't see why an agent is holding on to them for more than a week or so. Again, a lot of this stuff comes out in PDF form, and it should be an email to you. They should be able to forward it to you. So I would raise that.
Okay. And do all publishers provide royalty statements? That's another question.
They should, and that should be something that is listed out in your contract. I've seen some very small publishers that produce a really basic statement that is a royalty statement. I mean, that's another bandwagon I want to get on, is what is a good form royalty statement. Again, I don't know that author groups or we can affect change in the industry to say what should be on a royalty statement, but there's some real basic stuff that you would expect to be on there.
And then we have another question. What is reasonable to be deducted by publisher if royalties are based on net sales? Also, what royalty percent for print versus ebooks is reasonable?
So I'm not sure about the deductions question. Again, that's going to be contract driven. Now, net sales at its most basic form is gross sales minus returns equals net sales. Your contract might say that they can deduct shipping costs or something else, or normal trade discounts, whatever that is, although trade discounts are probably part of the net. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Let me pull it back up.
Yeah.
Also, what royalty percent for print versus ebooks is reasonable?
So I think Authors Guild has a lot on their site, but so print books, you know, there's ranges out there that you can see depending on the type of book, anywhere from, I'd say, 5 to 12, 13%. In higher education, you can see rates up to 18 to 20%. Ebooks started really around 25%. Some authors have contracts that where they've gone up. A lot of the original ebook, or a lot of the original contracts that had ebook rates in there talked about this most favored nations concept. So if the publisher generally started offering a higher rate on ebooks, then everybody would get that. So I think that has stopped publishers from really raising the ebook rates, because if they raise it for one author, they need to raise it for everyone. But there's a lot out there that you can read about what is the fair rate. Royalty rates initially kind of came to these certain rates that we have based on what was the fair split of gross margin between author and publisher. And it doesn't always work that way now, but that's kind of where you get some of these benchmark rates. So I don't want to tell you what the precise rate is, but I know Authors Guild does talk, I think in their Fair Contract Initiative writings, about ebook rates and what is fair. But a lot of it initially was driven off a margin, and the authors groups are saying ebook rates aren't high enough because you create a PDF, you distribute a file, say to Amazon, and then there's not the same cost of printing a book.
Okay. So there were a couple more that are kind of specific, so we'll send those to Julie, and we'll answer those for you separately, since they're kind of more specific questions. And this video is being recorded and will be housed on the Authors Guild website later, in case you want to, watch it again or look back at some of the slides. So thank you, Julie, so much.
Thank you very much
today, and thank you everyone for watching, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.